a flexible opening gambit, aiming to control central squares indirectly and prepare for swift knight deployment. Mirroring white's development, black immediately establishes central influence and prepares for a symmetrical battle, keeping options open. Preparing a fianchetto for the king's bishop, setting up a solid defensive structure and potential queenside pressure. Opening the center pawn immediately challenges white's kingside fianchetto, aiming for active piece play. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal prepares to exert pressure on black's central pawn chain. Fortifying the center with e6, black prepares to develop their pieces naturally and challenge white's kingside fianchetto. Solidifying the king's sanctuary allows for development to continue, creating a safe harbor before the storm of middle-game maneuvering. Preparing king safety and solidifying central pawn structure, this bishop now eyes kingside prospects or retreats to defend. Initiating central tension with pawn expansion, aiming to disrupt black's solid setup and gain space. Securing the monarch's safety now allows black to consider central pawn breaks, preparing for a more active piece deployment. Securing the queenside pawn structure and preparing for a timely nc3 advance, this allows white to develop the queen's bishop to an open diagonal while gently reinforcing the center. It subtly aims to restrict black's queenside expansion, potentially creating a positional bind for later exploitation. Black bravely confronts the queenside pawn advance, directly challenging white's central aspiration and aiming to dismantle the pawn chain that has been meticulously built. This aggressive stance opens up promising lines for development, potentially forcing concessions from white if the position is handled with precision. Solidifying the pawn chain while preparing for d4 offers white a compact, yet flexible structure, aiming to gradually build pressure and control the center. Boldly staking a claim in the center, this pawn thrust creates immediate friction, challenging white's previously harmonious setup and potentially disrupting their queenside development while opening lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen's bishop. Instantly resolving central tension, white embraces a more open game, trading a pawn for dynamic possibilities. This aggressive capture immediately challenges black's ambitious d4 pawn, potentially opening the e-file for white's rooks. The position transforms from a closed, maneuvering battle into something far more fluid and tactically charged. Consider how this exchange impacts piece activity and pawn structures moving forward. Opening the d-file now creates a dynamic imbalance, instantly challenging white's central pawn structure and offering black immediate active counterplay along that open corridor. Repositioning the pawn to d3 solidifies the center and prepares to develop the queen's bishop, aiming for a more robust pawn structure after the central exchange. Developing the knight to c6 firmly establishes a central presence, eyeing the d4 pawn and preparing to contest the now open d-file. This active placement not only bolsters black's central control, but also hints at potential future queenside expansion, perhaps with a timely b5 push. The knight's active square makes it a valuable piece for both defense and attack, ready to support an eventual e5 break or to join in a kingside maneuver. Bringing the queen to e2 centralizes the monarch, simultaneously supporting the e3 pawn and preparing a potential rook lift to the kingside. This subtle repositioning aims to enhance piece harmony and build pressure along the e-file, subtly challenging black's pawn chain. It's a quiet yet purposeful move, seeking to improve white's overall coordination. Shifting the knight to d7 prepares its potential redeployment to c5 or e5, aiming to disrupt white's central control and create attacking opportunities on the queenside. This maneuver also supports a potential pawn push on the queenside, opening lines for the rooks. Positioning the knight to d2 opens a crucial diagonal for the queen while preparing a potential kingside attack or reinforcing the center, offering white flexibility. Black aggressively stakes a claim in the center, daring white to embrace a more open game. This pawn push, e5, immediately challenges white's knight on d2 and forces a decision regarding central pawn structure. It seeks to disrupt white's comfortable development and potentially create a passed pawn later, but it also potentially weakens black's own pawn chain if white can exploit it. The game now pivots towards a more dynamic struggle, where piece activity and pawn tension will dictate the flow. Will white dare to capture, opening lines that might favor black's pieces, or will they opt for a more solid, perhaps slightly passive, response? The central squares are now a battlefield, and the consequences of this move will ripple throughout the board for many turns to come. Unleashing the knight to e4 creates immediate central pressure and opens up promising attacking avenues, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and seize control of key squares. This maneuver, bringing the rook to the center, effectively shores up the pawn chain's advance and prepares for potential king's side operations, while also implicitly offering a pawn sacrifice to achieve greater piece activity. Gaining a foothold on the queenside, white aims to constrain black's queenside majority and prepare a potential queenside expansion. Embarking on a queenside expansion, black signals an intention to contest white's space and potentially open lines for counterplay, creating an interesting battle for pawn control. A strategic retreat to unblock the bishop and prepare for a potential pawn push on the queenside, aiming to gain space and restrict black's pieces. Reinforcing the pawn on g7, black's king now rests a little more securely, preventing any immediate knight incursions to g4 and offering a subtle defensive shield. Unleashing a pawn storm towards the kingside, white aggressively seeks to dismantle black's defenses, aiming to open lines for immediate attack and potentially expose the enemy monarch. The knight retreats, a tactical regrouping to bolster the kingside defense after white's aggressive g4 advance, aiming to potentially launch an attack with the g-pawn. This maneuver simultaneously prepares to reroute the knight to a more active square, perhaps f7 to support the e5 pawn or even a surprising jump to h5. Unleashing a pawn storm is the immediate objective, aiming to rip open lines towards black's king and exploit the slightly awkward placement of white's own king. This aggressive pawn push signals a shift towards a more dynamic, perhaps even tactical, struggle, abandoning the calm positional maneuvering that characterized the opening. A bold decision to open the h-file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances against the exposed king. Black sacrifices material for dynamic play, initiating a complex tactical sequence. This aggressive action immediately transforms the game from a positional struggle into a sharp, double-edged contest where precise calculation will be paramount for both sides. The open diagonal for the g-pawn now presents a clear target. A bold thrust aiming to shatter black's central pawn structure and open lines for attacking pieces. Liberating the light-squared bishop from its pawn chain creates immediate pressure on the kingside and opens lines of attack, potentially targeting the f2 square or even indirectly influencing the central struggle. Opening up the queenside to exploit the slightly misplaced black knight on d7, creating an immediate imbalance and forcing black to react to a new strategic challenge. Exploring the central tension, black repositions the knight to d7, aiming to reinforce the pawn chain and prepare for potential pawn breaks. Pushing the queenside pawns forward in this fashion, 19. b4 seeks to exploit the weakened structure created by black's aggressive pawn advances on the kingside and center, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and potentially create an outpost on c5 or d5 for the knight. Suddenly, the queenside structure buckles under the pressure, opening new avenues for counterplay and forcing white to reevaluate their pawn chain. Reclaiming the open file provides a vital corridor for the rook, immediately posing a threat to black's vulnerable pawns and potentially initiating a swift kingside assault. Black repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing potential disruptions along the file and preparing to support a potential advance of the knight on d7. Shifting the rook to the open file aims to bolster central control and prepares for potential future pawn pushes down the e-file, even if it seems a bit passive at first glance. Reinforcing the bishop's defensive perimeter around the monarch, this repositioning strategically avoids the immediate tactical complications arising from white's advanced pawn phalanx, prioritizing positional solidity and preparing for a more fluid piece deployment in the subsequent exchanges. Unlocking the c-file presents a strategic opportunity, shifting the queen to c2 aims to support a potential pawn push along that very open corridor, adding pressure to black's queenside. A bold attempt to seize initiative on the queenside, challenging white's pawn advances and aiming to open lines for black's pieces, though it potentially weakens the pawn chain and creates new targets. White repositions the queen to avoid immediate threats and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the queen side, aiming to expand space and control more squares. Instantly redirects the rook to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure the queen side and prepare for potential breaks along the file or even a surprise sortie towards the white king if the opportunity arises through queenside pawn pushes. Initiating a pawn thrust up the king side, white prepares to unleash a torrent of attacking pieces, potentially creating new avenues of assault against the black king. Reclaiming central squares and challenging white's kingside initiative becomes paramount after this bishop maneuver. The rook's repositioning now directly challenges black's queenside pawn structure, aiming to exploit the awkward placement of the knight and potentially open lines for attack. Asserting control over the central squares while preparing a kingside pawn storm, white now faces a defensive challenge on the queenside. Black's bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses created by white's advancing pawns and offering some respite for the potentially cramped pieces. This maneuver, while seemingly passive, helps solidify black's structure and keeps options open for counterplay. Stepping back with the rook to the starting square creates a peculiar sort of quietude on the queen side, allowing white to reassess and potentially reposition for a more advantageous pawn advance or a subtle regrouping of forces. Recognizing the doubled pawns as potential long-term weaknesses, black decides to reinforce his bishop's activity, aiming to neutralize white's queenside pressure by keeping the g4 square protected and offering a piece exchange to simplify the position. The position has reached a state of strategic deadlock, and white's decision to reiterate the rook's position on the e-file suggests a lingering concern about black's kingside activity or a desire to maintain options for further pawn pushes. However, repeating a move like this often signals a lack of clear progress and can indicate a player searching for a breakthrough without a concrete plan, potentially allowing the opponent to solidify their position or exploit subtle weaknesses. Consider how black's dark-squared bishop on g4 exerts influence, and whether white's duplicated rook maneuver is truly addressing the strategic pressures or merely shuffling pieces without a decisive objective, possibly relinquishing the initiative. Rallying the knight from its passive posting, this piece now seeks to rejoin the fray, perhaps aiming for the vital c6 square or even preparing a surprise deployment on the queen side. Solidifying the bishop's outpost on d2, this move aims to bolster the queen side and prepare for potential pawn advances, while simultaneously creating a safer square for the king should the center ever open up. Shifting the monarch to the corner, kh8, is a subtle but important maneuver, anticipating potential central breakthroughs by white. It also creates an escape square on g7 should the g-file ever become dangerously open, a smart defensive precaution given the pawn advances. Striking at the king's defender, this pawn thrust aims to dislodge the knight and open lines for the queen and rook. Initiating a daring exchange, black liberates their bishop from passive defense, inviting a confrontation that could drastically reshape the kingside structure and expose the white monarch to potential threats, rather than continuing to fortify their own position passively. The bishop, repositioned, now directly challenges the central diagonal, potentially creating nasty pins or forcing awkward retreats from black's pieces. While seemingly a simple repositioning, this move subtly shifts the pressure, aiming to exploit any slight disarray in black's pawn structure or the king's safety. Observe how the bishop's new post on h3 adds a layer of complexity, creating potential for indirect attacks and demanding constant vigilance from the opponent. This maneuver endeavors to create long-range influence, questioning the robustness of black's queenside setup and preparing for further skirmishes. Anticipating a potential breakthrough, white aims to utilize this bishop to apply pressure across the board, forcing black to defend multiple weak points simultaneously. Unleashing the f-pawn creates immediate, explosive tension on the king side. Black sacrifices pawn structure for a potentially decisive assault against white's exposed monarch. A desperate attempt to activate the king and escape the looming threats on the queen side, though it opens up potential discovery tactics along the newly created diagonal. Unleashing a storm of checks on the weakened king. The immediate threat of the knight forks the king and queen, disrupting white's entire setup and forcing a concession or a significant material loss. This aggressive cavalry charge highlights the exposed nature of the white king, which has been left vulnerable by the pawn advances on the kingside and the absence of proper defensive support. The resulting forced exchanges will likely open lines and create opportunities for further tactical fireworks or a swift positional advantage. Suddenly, the central pawn structure is shattered, opening lines that were previously held captive, and transforming a static position into a dynamic battlefield where king's safety becomes paramount. Suddenly, the kingside opens up for black, creating immediate dangers for the white monarch. A bold recapture, embracing the open possibilities that emerge from the doubled pawns, now aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king. Embracing the immediate g-file threat, this decision to fortify the king's defenses by supporting the f-pawn acknowledges white's unleashed battery on the d-file and the lurking danger of the bishop pair. It's a pragmatic choice, sacrificing immediate central influence for crucial structural integrity, preventing a swift collapse. Rallying the rook into the heart of black's defenses, this maneuver aims to dismantle the pawn chain and exploit the lingering weaknesses around the king. The queen's relocation to b7 strategically repositions it to potentially exploit the now-open queen's file, while simultaneously creating a defensive screen for the king and offering a conduit for reinforcements to the queenside. The queen now eyeballs the weakened dark squares around black's monarch, creating immediate pressure and potential for swift tactical combinations. The dust settles as the queen exchanges create a stark, open position. Black must now contend with the lingering pressure on the kingside, while white aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure around the black king. Initiating a queen trade to simplify into a potentially favorable rook endgame, where white's active pieces can exploit black's compromised pawn structure and exposed king. The knight hops to the c6 square, a seemingly natural development, but strategically it presents a multifaceted challenge for black's position. This action initiates a subtle pawn endgame battle by centralizing the knight, potentially eyeing the weak d4 pawn if white isn't careful. However, it also surrenders control of the important d4 square, a concession that could prove costly if white correctly exploits the open d-file. Consider the long-term implications. Is this knight better placed here for defense or for a future offensive sortie? The pressure on the c-pawn is now palpable, forcing white to consider their own pawn structure and defensive capabilities in the coming exchanges. The knight's leap to d4 injects immediate dynamism, seizing central control and threatening to unravel black's position with newfound pressure on the c6 knight, and the potential to exploit the weakened pawn structure on the queenside. Reclaiming the pawn on d4 creates immediate central pressure, but the knight's relocation to d4 is a tactical gamble that opens up your king and invites further complications, especially with white's active rook now eyeing the queenside. Suddenly, the isolated rook on d4 anchors itself, a powerful pivot controlling the entire file and threatening to slice through black's defenses, while simultaneously preparing to challenge the knight and potentially penetrate further into the enemy camp. The king's retreat to g7 initiates a crucial repositioning phase, aiming to shield the monarch from the open g-file and prepare for potential defensive maneuvers amidst the remaining material imbalance. Recapturing on c1 solidifies white's central presence and prepares to contest the open files. Navigating the ensuing rook endgame, black aims to connect the rooks and contest the open file, hoping to disrupt white's imposing pawn chain and eventually find activity for his pieces. Suddenly, the white pawn advances, piercing the queenside and creating a new obstacle for black's coordination. Shifting the king to f6 is a bold attempt to centralize the monarch, aiming to bring it into the fray for defensive and potentially offensive purposes as the queens are off the board. But it also exposes it to increased scrutiny from white's rook on the fourth rank and bishop on the diagonal. This pawn thrust fundamentally alters the landscape, creating a dynamic pawn chain aimed at challenging black's cramped kingside. This pawn push immediately ignites the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and create immediate counterplay along the now open c-file. Suddenly, the knight leaps into action, creating a crucial fork that forces the black king to expose itself further. The king, under duress from the knight's powerful check, retreats to a seemingly safer square, though the looming white rook and pawn chain continue to pressure the queenside. Unleashing a decisive rook check forces the king into an exposed square, preparing to seize control of the critical 7th rank. Reclaiming the initiative through a series of forcing exchanges, black accepts the sacrifice, aiming to untangle their remaining pieces after the dust settles. The endgame is rapidly simplifying as the rook on d7 now definitively claims the 7th rank, a significant positional achievement. The bishop retreats to a defensive square, aiming to preserve its presence on the diagonal as the exchange sacrifice looms, though its influence has waned significantly since its earlier centralizing efforts. Reclaiming the open file with the rook reestablishes a crucial presence and prepares to challenge black's remaining pieces. Escaping the confined rook on e1 with the king offers a glimmer of counterplay, aiming to activate a piece that has been a spectator for too long and perhaps find sanctuary behind the advancing pawns. The knight's aggressive foray creates a critical fork, demanding immediate attention and forcing the black king out of its sanctuary, exposing it to further threats. Capturing the knight on g5 relinquishes a crucial piece that was actively defending white's weak pawns and controlling key squares, leaving black's king in the path of further aggression. Seizing the open file with the rook now allows white to immediately assert control and pressure black's isolated pawn structure. The rook, now activated on the 7th rank, aims to disrupt white's isolated pawn and create counterplay before the central pawns are fully secured. Reasserting control over the d-file with the rook, forcing a decision on how black will defend that crucial square. Reclaiming the pawn on the d-file offers a glimmer of hope for black to simplify into an endgame, but the immediate challenge is neutralizing white's rook, which now aggressively occupies the 7th rank. Seizing the open file with the rook now promises a significant advantage, as it can pressure black's isolated pawns and prepare for potential exchanges that favor white's pawn structure. The rook's journey from defending the pawns to a potential outpost on the 3rd rank is ambitious, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay. The rook boldly ventures onto the 6th rank, aiming to disrupt black's isolated pawn chain and potentially infiltrate dangerous territory towards the exposed black king. Bathing the king in exposed light, the bishop's advance disrupts any nascent tranquility, creating immediate tactical fireworks as it seeks to exploit the recent rook sacrifice and the king's compromised perimeter. Preserving the monarch's safety becomes paramount as the board simplifies, aiming to navigate toward a playable endgame. Black's bishop now reclaims its important diagonal, eyeing white's vulnerable king and offering protection to the remaining pawns. Finally, the bishop returns to defend the beleaguered king, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of positional integrity after a series of pawn sacrifices and exchanges that have left white's king exposed. The rook's journey to the 1st rank now attempts to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure, aiming to trade itself for the isolated c-pawn and potentially activate the bishop on f3 by clearing lines. Seizing control of the crucial dark squares, this check forces black's king into a vulnerable position, paving the way for white's pieces to dominate the center and create mating threats. The black king, now exposed in the center, faces immediate threats from white's active pieces, forcing a defensive scramble rather than any offensive ambition. Pushing this pawn forward aims to gain crucial space on the queenside, potentially restricting black's pieces and opening avenues for further penetration. Embracing the chaos, black unleashes this pawn's potential, seeking to disrupt white's structural harmony and introduce immediate attacking possibilities before the queens are fully removed from the board. The monarch desperately scrambles for safety, abandoning its central post in pursuit of a more secure perimeter on the kingside wing. Unleashing a surprising bishop sortie, Black aims to disrupt white's pawn chain and create new attacking avenues, hoping to exploit the newly opened diagonal for its queen and rook, while simultaneously seeking to gain time for its own king's safety or a potential pawn push.